Attention, please. Would members of the Community Development and Recreation Committee please report to Committee Room 1 for quorum? Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for coming back. We're going to continue with deputations on item 5. I'm looking for Yogi Akara. Thank you very much for coming. You have 5 minutes.
My name is Yogi Acharya. I'm an organizer with the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty. I have to be honest, I was surprised to see the open letter that was released yesterday, which a few of you here are a signatory to. While the position the letter takes and the actions that it calls for isn't a dramatic departure from the position this committee took back in November, the fact that councillors who were then opposed to these measures have signed on to it is a good development. It gives homeless people and their allies reason to be cautiously optimistic, but historical record also warns against complacency. Current trends in shelter usage call for the addition of at least 1,500 permanent shelter beds to bring occupancy levels down to 90% and bring the system closer to guaranteeing a spot to everyone in need. Furthermore, come April, unless every single resident of the backup facilities, the warming centers, the drop-ins, the out of the cold, can be guaranteed a spot, the respite centers, including the armories, can't shut down, and conditions within them need to improve. At the press conference this morning, some of you mentioned motions that you might move that would address both of these concerns. So we will be following the outcome of this meeting and developments over the next few weeks closely. Homeless people in this city, as you know, are in crisis, and your committee has, once again, the opportunity to push for policies that could stem the horrifying trend of 8 homeless people dying every month. That said, certain councillors, including until very recently the mayor himself, and some homeless advocates oppose the expansion of the shelter system because they say money spent on shelter should instead be spent on housing. I think the position is worth addressing because while they are correct in asserting that housing is the ultimate solution and must be funded, they're insistent that money spent on providing emergency shelter is a hindrance in the pursuit of that goal is flawed and frankly dangerous. This is not only because this position is oblivious to the deadly conditions facing homeless people on the ground and the legacy of decisions that bring us to this, but also because they wittingly or unwittingly lend their support to members of council who use precisely that reasoning to refuse to address the worsening homeless crisis. It must be noted that while decision makers at all three levels of government talk about the need for affordable or supportive housing, their policies have actively plunged us ever deeper into the housing crisis. The ownership market is inflated to a point where it doesn't even merit consideration as an option for middle-income people, let alone those trying to survive on low incomes. So let's talk about rental housing. The Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation pegs the average market rent in Toronto for a one-bedroom apartment to be just over $1,200. For a person earning the new $14 minimum wage, a 21% increase over last year, and working 40 hours a week, renting a one-bedroom apartment requires them to spend over 60% of their income on housing. The fact that social housing is on shambles is well known, as is the heartbreaking 10-year-long wait list for the nearly 200,000 people languishing on its wait list. Yet, hundreds of units stay on course to be boarded up by the end of this year for the lack of repair funding. As more people lose grip on housing, funds such as the Housing Stabilization Fund, a fund this committee is actually responsible for, have become critical. But Council's negligence has resulted in nearly $14 million of HSF money being withheld from reaching the poorest people in housing need over the past 4 years. Councillors and decision makers at all levels of government can't claim that housing is the solution to homelessness when your policies are actively gutting it. Members of the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty, the organization that I'm a part of, have occupied buildings, have faced criminal charges and arrests to force you, decision makers at council, but also at other levels of government, to take action on housing. Actions that have turned vacant buildings into social housing that continues to provide people a home to this day. Last November, we mobilized people in at least a dozen cities across Canada to demand that the federal government spend the $11 billion they committed to housing over the next 2 years instead of 11, a measure that would actually help the city meet its housing needs. So if you're serious about housing, then work with us and start by stopping the closure of the hundreds of TCHC units this year, protect rooming houses, curtail the reckless speculation in the housing market, and stop catering to big developers. But until that happens, people need shelter. The place where proposals that could address the shelter crisis that we're mired in today emerge here. And that's why I'm here to call on you today, along with the other folks here, to do the right thing and to not abandon homeless people to the streets.
Thank you very much. Questions for the deputants? Thank you very much. Louise Smith. Thank you for coming. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today on behalf of Covenant House Toronto. As Canada's largest agency serving at-risk, homeless and trafficked youth, Covenant House Toronto changes lives by providing the widest range of services and support to as many as 250 youth a day. Since opening our doors in 1982, Covenant House has served over 95,000 young people. Most homeless youth are not on the street by choice. They come from every part of the country and are of any background, and most have fled or been forced out of their homes where there is abuse and childhood trauma. Youth are staying in our 96-bed crisis shelter 50% longer than they did 7 years ago. The demand for youth shelter beds is high. On any given night in Canada, up to 7,000 young people may be homeless. Each night, over 430 youth are occupying youth-designated shelter beds. Unfortunately, due to this high demand, some have no choice but to use the adult system or to stay on the streets. As stated by the Toronto Alliance to End Homelessness, creating a new supportive housing options in our city will take a similar amount of time than it would to create new shelters. We must respond to the real, urgent, and emergency needs of young people experiencing homelessness, while also providing long-term, stable, and diverse housing options for youth. By providing youth with the support they need to transition out of homelessness into stable, independent lives, we can work to prevent long-term chronic homelessness that continues into adulthood. We can't end homelessness through an expansion of shelter and emergency services. We need to provide youth-specific housing options and approaches and shift our focus from managing the crisis to preventing it. A housing-first approach for youth requires different models of accommodations and services, including family reconnection support, varying levels of supported housing, transitional housing, and independent living options. We strongly urge you to commit to more long-term affordable housing options for young people, including supportive and transitional housing. Youth experiencing homelessness in Toronto require specific supports to enable them to grow and develop into healthy adults. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Councillor Cressy.
Well, Louise, thank you for being here, and welcome to your new job at Covenant House. Sorry to lose you from our ward at the YMCA.
Yeah.
Congratulations, Councillor Wong-Tam. On transitional housing for youth, do you have a sense of what the current waiting list is for youth being able to access transitional housing opportunities?
I know that currently the two organizations that offer transitional housing that I'm familiar with both have long wait lists, waiting at around 75 young people to get into YMCA Sprott House.
Yeah.
And I'm assuming that the Rites of Passage at Covenant House also has a similarly long wait list for transitional housing.
And just so that when we get into the housing first approach, and there's been a lot of discussion today about ensuring that we have adequate shelter spaces and dignified quality shelter spaces coupled with an approach to a housing first model, the upstream housing approach we've heard. Do you have a sense on the funding framework, at least at Covenant House, and how that is split for transitional housing options for youth, be it at the provincial and municipal level?
My understanding is that the funding comes through the municipal level, through the province, and that I don't actually know what the actual splits are, but they are my understanding is that they're funded under the emergency shelter system and come through that.
So,
right.
I mean, I guess a question I would have is, so in the motion that's being advanced here today, there are a number of immediate measures that we're calling for around the current situation we're in, getting to the 90% occupancy rate. We've also requested that as part of the meeting in 4 weeks' time in February, we do a deep dive both into our shelter system as well as the transitional housing side. Would it be helpful for us to have ministry, LIN representatives or other provincial representatives here to present at that meeting as well, so that we're actually looking at this together? Is that something we should look at doing?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Councillor Cressy. Councillor Fletcher?
Earlier, thank you for coming. Oh, I'm not done. You're not done.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, no, stay.
Earlier, I had asked one of the deputies, because you're speaking about housing and transitional housing and inclusionary zoning, and if you've had a chance to look at that legislation and if you think it meets the requirement. So I don't know if you've had a chance, but are you aware that are you interested in that? Making sure that developments aren't just all $1 million condos for sale in the city of Toronto. I'm looking at a lot of nodding from the.
Yeah.
I'll ask you to, Pat, when you get there.
I mean, I'm not aware of the legislation, but the way that you put it, absolutely, that would be something.
So, are you part of the Toronto Alliance?
Covenant House is part of that, yes.
So, and I don't think she's here now, but that makes sense to me. Might make sense to you that the Alliance really look at the ability to create housing, transitional permanent housing, which would free up people moving from shelters into housing, our waiting list, be part of that larger housing push around inclusionary zoning. So just ask if you would be willing to make yourself informed about inclusionary
I would, yeah.
zoning. And would you let people know that on January 25th at 2 o'clock in this very room, there will be a special meeting of planning and growth about inclusionary zoning and how developers should also be paying for housing.
Okay, thank you. I will
Thank
do
you
that.
very much.
Yeah.
Thank you, Councillor Fletcher. Councillor Wong-Tam?
Yes, thank you very much, and welcome to Ward 27, I guess.
Thank you, thank you.
It's happening here.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, with respect to the facility at Covenant House on Gerrard Street, at any given time, I get the sense that you're fairly full.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and when are you not full?
Never.
Never.
Yeah.
And when you do have to turn people away, and I know it's difficult,
Yeah.
largely because of occupancy standards, where do you send them?
So I think part of the process is we never turn people away onto the streets. So we will look for other youth shelters that might be available for young people. So that may mean calling around to each of the youth centers, checking in with Shark, Peter Street, seeing if there's any spaces. If we cannot find a space for someone, they will stay in our space until we can find a place for them, especially during this cold weather.
And where do they stay when they're in your space?
There's a great hall that we have, a large sort of loungy space where young people would stay. We do try to make sure that we're managing our numbers because of the actual physical space. We want to make sure that we're maintaining safety, so it's always a bit of a balance.
And when they're in this cavernous hall, like, do you take out cots or beds or mats?
There are couches on that space, yeah.
Oh, I see.
Our idea is to find someone a bed as soon as possible.
Right, and how long does it take by the time you realize that you can't take them on as a new client? How long does it take from the point of contact with you to the point that they get another bed? Assuming all your couches are full.
Yeah, it depends. It really depends on
1 hour, 2 hours?
I mean, it could take 15 to 20 minutes to do the call around to see if there's other spaces, and if there's another space for someone, then we will make sure that they have adequate transportation to get to that space, or we will keep calling until we can find something.
Do you get compensated for the extra person on the couch?
No.
No. And at any given time, how many extra people might be not necessarily official registered guests, but happen to need a place to stay?
I cannot answer that question right now. This is the start of my 3rd week there. So I will find out, though.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then finally, a question regarding your new service around individuals and youth that are targeted, trafficked. Can you give us a sense of how that is being funded, and how does that relate to the shelter programs? Because it's obviously not, I don't believe it's listed in the subsectors.
Right.
Is that full? Is it running well? Can you give us a sense of that?
We have 2 beds that are designated for young women who are experiencing sex trafficking or trying to lead sex trafficking. My understanding as well is that they are also quite full all the time and used quite often. And my belief is that, and again, this is week 3, so my belief is that a lot of the money comes through the province.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Councillor Wong Tam. Councillor Mahevik?
Yes, thank you very much. I know the good work that you do. My nephew works for you folks. The question that I have following on Councillor Wong Tam's is, so does your frontline worker looking for a place for a youth, they don't have a master database of all the agencies that you can kind of see in real time, okay, there's a space here, there's not a space here?
No.
You have to have a kind of Rolodex, so to speak, of the 52 agencies, well, not all of them serve youth, but of the 10 city shelters, and you have to go, your frontline worker's job is to go through it one by one, and they have an instinct as to, or a history of how to access beds where they might be available.
Yeah. And the referral center, that's the other place.
And the referral, so they also phone the referral
Yeah.
center. Okay, I'll ask staff this, but are you aware if they have the master kind of, call it the software that knows which spaces are available when in real time?
I wouldn't know, but it would be best to ask them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Mahevik, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Greg Cook? For coming, you have 5 minutes.
Hello, CDRC. Thank you for this opportunity to speak. My name is Greg Cook. I'm an outreach worker at Sanctuary and have been an outreach worker and drop-in worker for over 10 years. A big part of my job as an outreach worker is to come alongside people who are in crisis. I endeavor to listen well, offer a respectful and safe space to problem solve, and also to offer options. For me, it feels like as a result of our current housing and shelter crisis in Toronto, 95% of the time, it's choosing the least bad option amongst numerous catastrophic options. One example of a least bad option this winter has been the offer of a sleeping bag or a toque as a result of the overcapacity of the shelter and winter respite system. The sleeping bag is a bad option compared to the option of a warm and safe bed, yet it is not as bad as freezing to death. Today, I'm going to speak from my perspective, my expertise. First, about the crisis that over 6,500 plus people face each night in this city as a result of not having housing. Second, about the system crisis that is connected to lack of housing people can afford in this city, and to the shelter system crisis, to the subsequent healthcare and hospital crisis as well. First, a middle-aged Indigenous couple I know well have been housed in a small studio apartment for about a year. They have a great sense of humor, love Russian literature, and have a deep ethic of being generous and loving to their neighbors and friends. In the cold months before the winter respite centers open, this couple often opened up their apartment for as many as 6 friends who needed a warm space to sleep. As a result of the respite centers not offering adequate space, they continue to offer their space after November 14. Unfortunately for this generous couple, one of their guests left the stove on. There was a small fire, and the fire department had to be called. As a result of this crisis in the midst of a much bigger system crisis, this couple lost their home 2 days before Christmas, and they were left homeless. The 2 of them and the others staying at their place were forced to try and find spaces in the respite centers. As a result of the poor conditions of the respite centers and being homeless in the winter, both of these people ended up in the emergency room with pneumonia. Within a few days, they were discharged to the respite and shelter system. As an organization, we worked really hard to advocate against this discharge because they were homeless. This didn't work. Currently, this couple is out in the cold and homeless. Currently, our organization is considering paying for last month's rent so this couple can get housing as soon as possible. The current government subsidies have failed them. Second, that the housing and shelter system crisis. If we added the number of respite spaces to the shelter bed capacity, we can confidently say that the shelter occupancy rate has been between 104% and 110% over the last month. Steve Meyer has done some important math on this. As Toronto considers adding 1,000 new emergency shelter beds, here's some scary math. Last night, 6,345 individuals required emergency shelter in Toronto. The total number of emergency shelter beds available in Toronto last night was 5,896. Now take away the 1,519 temporary contracted motel beds, and the total number of permanent shelter beds available in the city last night was 4,377. To reach 90% occupancy and ensure the safety of our most vulnerable residents, Toronto needs 7,050 permanent shelter beds. In summary, 7,050 shelter beds, that's what's required, minus 4,377 shelter beds, that's what we have now, equals 2,673 shelter beds. That's what we still need. This crisis in our housing and shelter system is costing lives. This year, over 80 people died without housing in our city, according to City of Toronto data. As an outreach worker, I'm endeavoring to do some outreach to you, councillors, here in this room. Your decisions on this matter. You have important life and death choices that you need to make. You can choose to continue to go forward with the trajectory Toronto is on. I'll call it the Los Angeles model. Los Angeles isn't much bigger than Toronto, yet on any given night, its homeless population is 57,800. Only 26% are in shelters. The elderly population of homeless is growing. Nearly 1/4 are 55 and older. The average homeless woman in the city's experience as much major violence in a single year as the average American
You're
woman.
a little over 5 minutes, if you could wrap up.
Okay,
Thank you.
my last paragraph. Or the city can strike out on a different trajectory. I'll call this the Toronto 1980s model. I say this because I want to emphasize that you can do much better. We need tens of thousands of affordable housing units. As a city, you need to be realistic in our current political climate. Right now, we need warm beds in our city. We need the Fort York Armories opened. We need current respite centers to stay open until better options are available. In the short term, we need 1,500 new shelter beds built this year and 1,500 beds in 2019. It would be criminal to push more people out into the cold this year.
Thank you very much. Questions for the deputant? Councillor Wong Tam.
Thank you very much for your deputation. I want to ask, as an outreach worker, when you have a conversation with someone who's looking for accommodations, whether it's shelter or affordable housing, how do you take that information and feed it into the shelter management information system?
So as an outreach worker, if somebody's saying I need a shelter bed that night, I'd call the central intake number. Most of the time, I experience long holds, long delay, like don't even get to talk to somebody for sometimes 10 minutes, 20 minutes. And then a number of times I've reached them and the answer has been we don't have any space, please come to the Peter Street Referral Center.
So when you call them at central intake, they tell you to physically go with the client to Peter Street?
They encourage me to tell the client that's where they can go. So it's depending on what other responsibilities I have at that time. I'm sometimes able to accompany them. Sometimes the best I'm able to do is give them a token.
Why would they tell you to go to Peter Street if you've already called central intake?
Because they inform me that the system's full.
So then wait at Peter until they can find another bed. And,
Yeah,
they might
and this is, I mean, this has been an issue that I've encountered for over 5 years.
And so what does the intake system look like for you? Because obviously it's, you have interactions with people who are either street involved directly right on the street, or they're coming into the sanctuary, which is a drop-in. What does that intake look like? Like, how do you track the movement of that individual and whether or not they get housed in the long run?
So because we're a drop-in and actually have essentially no city funding, we have probably a different model than most city-run drop-ins. Primarily, we aim to offer a safe space for people to have a meal and to connection. We have a medical clinic and so on. But we try to respond in the moment to the situation and either connect them with other services. Like this couple I mentioned, they're connected to Indigenous organizations and we kind of work with them. So depending on what the person identifies as their needs, whether that's immediate shelter at that time or whether they're in the shelter system and the housing worker at the shelter system hasn't been able to get to them, and so they're looking for any help they can get.
The couple that you described, the couple that was housed in the studio that is now on the street, is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
How long have they been lost in the system? Like they went from being housed to now being unhoused.
So they lost their housing on December 23rd when there was the crisis, up until now.
Do they now have an outreach worker? I mean, yourself, I guess, is the outreach worker. Do they have a housing worker? Or?
So each of them individually have, through 2 different Indigenous agencies, have a housing worker, yes.
And so they're in touch with their housing worker regularly. They're in touch with their support team regularly. When do you anticipate that they may be housed again?
So again, we've been informed by their housing workers that the regular subsidy system, if we let that try to solve the problem as far as getting first and last month's rent, and because they have a place they've seen, that they will not be able to take that place. So as an organization, we're like, this is like, we need $900 here, frankly. I don't want to go into too many details, but we can make sure this couple's housed, right? And so we don't have the same restraints as maybe city-run drop-ins. And we're like, this is a no-brainer. We want people housed.
Yeah, so as an organization that doesn't get any government funding, that operates solely as a...
Except for our health clinic, yeah.
Okay, so there's that component. But generally, you don't provide housing supplements?
No.
No, but you are about to make a decision about whether or not you want to take out the $900 from your budget to pay for this couple's last month's rent so they can get into housing.
Yes.
How will they stay in housing afterwards?
I don't know the details, obviously their housing, but I assume that month in, month out, they'd have the income to cover that. For many people, that's why you have the startup allowance is because most places you need first and last month's rent, right? And so that makes it really complicated when you have a fixed income of hardly anything.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions for the deputant?
Were you in touch with Wood Green Community Services, which does this type of work on an emergency basis for this family?
So we try to utilize any agency we can. Definitely, we work with Wood Green on.
Have you been in touch with him about that?
About this
This
specifically?
family, yeah.
No, when we were letting their housing workers deal with that portfolio more, we've just been informed by their housing worker that this is what they need to get in.
They
And
have housing workers,
yes, yeah, that's what I was. Yeah,
and,
not through our agency.
and they haven't found housing. And the housing.
They've seen a place, but again, they don't have the funds currently.
And the housing workers are through which agency? I missed that.
I'd rather not. I don't want to give too many details, just because of privacy. But two Indigenous agencies that are well known in the city.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Fletcher. Just very quickly, you mentioned, did you mention that 80 people have died on the streets this year? And I'm just.
So there was a newspaper article that came out in September saying that 70 had, according to the city stats. Because I'm involved with the Toronto Homeless Memorial, I'm aware that the number is over 80. I don't know the exact amount. That will, I think, come out shortly, that their report, the official city report.
And that was from a newspaper article?
It's from the city health department. But the Toronto Star article quoted them. Joyce Bernstein, I think, is.
All right, we can get clarity when question staff. I hadn't heard that figure before, nor did I find any newspaper articles on fatalities this year.
I could email it to you if you'd like, sir.
And the coroner, is the coroner still doing street autopsies, or?
So I understand that the coroner doesn't have a mandate to do an autopsy on all homeless deaths, only if it's considered not natural. So in certain situations, I'm aware that people who die while they're homeless, the death is considered not natural, and so in that case, the coroner would do an autopsy. From what I understand, is that over half of the people who are homeless, who have died homeless, their death is understood as not natural, and so the coroner has been involved in a number of them.
Okay, thank you very much. A.J. Withers?
Good afternoon.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you. So my name's AJ Withers. I'm an organizer with the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty. I'm also a PhD candidate at York University School of Social Work, and my research is supported by the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada. And my research is related to these issues. So I think as you all know, that this is a crisis and has been talked about a little bit. This crisis is going to get worse in the coming years. Rents are going up, social assistance is going down, is being lost in real dollars due to inflation. And housing is obviously very, very important and very important part of the solution, but is not one or the other with shelters. We need shelter beds and we need them now. A number of councillors have expressed some confusion about how we have calculated the number of beds that we need. So in my written deputation, which you have, and it's also here on the screen, is a calculation for last night for what the shelter system looked like. So there were 713, whoa, okay, I can't do that, sorry. 713 people in the winter overnight usage system the night before last. And so what the numbers that Greg gave you were numbers that removed the motel system. These numbers don't. This is a formula that was developed by people at Street Health and has been the formula that's been used since last April. This is how the 1,000-bed demand came about, and as you can see, has risen dramatically as things continue to get worse in this city. And so if we take the number of people in the shelters to bring it down to 90%, the number of people in the winter respite system, the number of people sleeping rough based on the 2013 needs assessment, we come up with 1,500 beds. This is, I would argue, a great underestimate, and I'm happy to go into why in questions if you have them. So we have this situation here where we need a lot of beds. Come April 15th, if you didn't bring forward the motion to keep the winter respite open, we would have a lot of people with nowhere to go. I am very concerned, as are many people, that the Out of the Colds are not going to remain open in spite of your best efforts and your requests. And so right off the start, we have 113 people last night that would have nowhere to go. So things like closing the armory are untenable. We need to keep the Moss Park Armory open, and we need to keep these spaces open as well as continue to find other emergency solutions while permanent beds are being opened. We want to see, ideally, these 713 beds being opened right away, while through the year we see, ideally, 1,514 beds being opened as of last night. But as you can imagine, these numbers fluctuate dramatically, not dramatically, they fluctuate somewhat depending on the night. But one thing that's consistent is that they've continued to rise since December at least. Another really intense concern that a number of people have raised is the conditions of the winter respite sites. All Saints and Margaret's have been raised very cold in those spaces. People are really crowded, and St. Felix as well is very concerning. I hope that people remember that last year, Pierre Georgie, a 28-year-old Indigenous man, died after being allowed into St. But warming center around Kensington Market, and he was allowed in for 20 minutes, half an hour, but told that he had to leave because they were at capacity, and he died shortly thereafter. And St. Felix continues to not let people in when they're at capacity beyond a short period of time, even though when I visited there, at capacity means that they have a number of chairs open. And so my understanding is that they may be telling people now where they can go. That might be recent.
You're pretty well at 5 minutes
Okay,
if you could
thank
just
you.
wrap up.
I'll finish up really quickly. So those conditions need to change. 1,000 beds is a really great start. Those beds need to have low barrier shelters. We need physical accessibility for people. There's no beds for many wheelchair users in particular. We need beds for women and non-binary people, pets, people with pets, and for couples. We're very optimistic, but very cautiously optimistic about moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Cressy, Councillor Wong Tam.
Well, listen, thank you for being here and for the detailed assessment that you've done on the numbers. I take to heart a number of the points you've mentioned, but I do want to push back on one thing you said there, which was you said that Pierre George was told he had to leave.
Okay.
Was it?
So my understanding is that he was told that he could come in for some time, that there was no place for him for the night, and then he would have to go.
So
Is not that the case?
I just want to be very careful here. This was in my ward. I knew Pierre.
Yeah.
And it was devastating. And our fabulous staff at St. Felix said they did not have space for him to sleep, but he could stay there sitting in the area, and that they would work to find space for him. And so that is inadequate. It's not acceptable. It should not, we should have space, but he was not told he had to leave.
Okay, I appreciate that. What they did tell people this winter when it was incredibly cold was that they could go in for 20 to 30 minutes. They wouldn't turn people away, but they could go in for 20, 30 minutes. They would have to leave, go outside, and then wait until someone left permanently. And they were not being told that there were other spaces anywhere else available.
No, I understand that this winter, and I take to heart and agree with much of what you've said. I just want to contest the notion that Pierre George was told he had to leave, because that is not what happened.
I thank you for the correction. And I also think that St. Felix does a really great job, and I think that more support for these places that are being open through the winter under really difficult conditions is really necessary.
Completely agree. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Councillor Wong-Tam?
Thank you. With respect to the condition of the winter respites, previous speaker Kathy Crow was asking that we develop some standards. And those standards, I think, from my experiences, standards are good, but they're only good if they're actually complied with. So, for example, we have a 90% occupancy shelter standard. The council has now learned that we've never quite met that. You support the development, I guess, of new respite out of the code standards. What's the consequence when the city doesn't follow its own standards? What should be the consequence?
Well, one thing that I think might be useful is to have the monitor of the standards be public health rather than shelter support and housing, because then at least it's not the same body that's responsible for administering and monitoring. I think that's a basic public administration policy. In terms of consequences, I don't know. Like, we'll come back. Like, OCAP is a consequence. The media is a consequence. That's basically how we've been able to maintain other standards when they've been broken in the past, when we've become aware of them. I don't think that it's acceptable that that's when shelter standards are violated, that it has to be advocates and homeless people that have to fight for those standards to be brought. But that's on you. I think you need to figure out how to make sure that those are met, and ideally there wouldn't have to be any consequences. Ideally that they would just be being met.
You showed numbers on the screen around the estimates of the number of beds, 1,000, 1,500 in your case. You also mentioned that it's an underestimation. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so there are a number of reasons why that's the case. So it would go up if you calculated it by sector. So right now it's calculated to 90% overall, but if you did it sector by sector, those numbers would increase. So for example, women are at 99%, 98, 99% most of the time, and then other sectors kind of drag the average down. It would also go up if you calculated the family motels, I would argue properly, where right now it's my understanding that the family motels are calculated in such a way that if there are 4 people in a motel room with an occupancy of 5, that's calculated as 1 empty bed, but no one is ever going to fill that bed. So there's an empty bed being added into the system that's non-existent. It would also go up if we counted the people who are currently being, families that are staying in motels that are using their welfare checks to, that are waiting to get into the family shelter motels. So because the shelter motels are full, welfare has been paying people's shelter money to motels, sometimes right nearby. And so those families are so detrimental to those families because that's much more than their shelter amount, and they're guaranteed almost to be homeless for the rest of the month. So if those families were counted in, then the number would go up. Hidden homeless people, like the people that Greg was talking about that were sleeping on the floor, aren't calculated. The streets needs assessment from 2013 is an underestimate. We know that homelessness has gone up since 2013, and there are some methodological concerns with that study. So I think those are some of the key reasons why it's an underestimate, but that's a concrete way that we can show you what the real need is right now.
Okay, thank you very much, AJ.
Councillor Fletcher?
Hi, thank you. Did you say you put that chart in with your correspondence?
Yeah, so
You've turned that in already?
Yeah, it's
Do you have it?
25.5.2.
Okay, thank you. I'll find that. Thanks a million.
Any other questions? No. Okay, thanks very much. Dana Dack.
You'll be happy, it'll be short and sweet. I'm a harm reduction peer worker at Sistering. The main drop-in is so overcrowded, women are literally tripping over each other. A lady I know actually tripped over a woman and spilled her coffee on her, which in turn, that woman got up and attacked the lady that spilled her coffee. Another lady had all her belongings in a gym bag, and another woman rolled into it with her shopping cart and ripped the lady's bag. Like, this is, you know, I myself have witnessed the women fighting for one reason or another. I can see this is due to no personal space. Some of these women are already fleeing traumatic situations, only to be further traumatized in situations caused by overcrowdedness. I believe living in these horrific conditions can cause mental illness in the long run. A 24-hour drop-in is not a shelter. There are well over 50 women staying at Sistering with only one running shower. I am not saying anything bad about the organizations that offer these services. They do their best with the funding they're given, but it's not enough. Due to the failure of adequate shelters or beds, I fear we will continue to see illness and death. The homeless are in crisis, and why are we not focusing on housing them? That's what I got.
Thank you very much. Any questions for the deputant? Councillor Wong Tam.
Yes, thank you. Sistering has been very active and engaged in raising the awareness at City Hall about what's happening to your facility. And I've heard now from your executive director, we've heard from frontline workers in terms of on-site workers, we've heard from your clients, and now we've heard from you as a harm reduction worker. And every single one of you is delivering exactly the same message. Given the fact that there aren't that many 24-hour women's exclusive drop-in facilities, is this the same condition that we can expect if we go to those other facilities?
I couldn't tell you. I just have my experience with Sistering. I've seen it change because I actually advocated it for it to become a 24-hour drop-in. It's changed dramatically. Because of the overcrowdedness, people are at each other's throats. And honestly, I've actually stood in the middle of Sistering and yelled at everybody and said, you know what, we're all in this together. You know, can't we all just get along? But tensions rise when you have no personal space. I would lose it too.
And so when you have people coming in to use the facility and they honestly just need a place to, you know, grab a hot meal or just take a break from the code, but you've got this sort of volatile and very hostile environment, what happens to those individuals that come in that we would normally want to see to come into the Sistering? Not that we don't want the people there to get service, but how much more can you take on? Like, is there flexibility in your
to my knowledge, Sistering has not turned any women away, not to date. Regardless. A lot of women will leave because of the traumatic situations. The lady that accidentally tripped over the one lady and spilled her coffee, she's no longer at Sistering. She left. I don't know where she went. As far as I know, she could be somewhere that's unsafe or, you know, like, I don't know.
Are people that drop into, are the women that use the Sistering drop-in facility, are most of them housed?
No.
In a shelter anywhere?
It's because we meet everybody where they're at. Some people are homeless, some are, like me, myself, I use the services, but I am housed. I'm underhoused, mind you, but I'm housed. And I'm thankful for even being underhoused because I see what these women are going through. You know, and it's just, I wish I could, because I've actually done it. My friend of mine a few years ago, she lost her housing because she got in a fire. And I had her and her boyfriend come stay with me. Now I have a small little bachelor, and all I was sleeping on myself was like a flex mat because funding for anybody on social services is not enough. My rent's way too high to afford furniture. So I had us all sleeping on a mat on the floor. We were literally looked like a Kit Kat, the four of us, you know, because I have such a small unit. But we do what we can, you know. And it just, I don't know. We just try to band together and make things a little easier, you know, especially if we're all in the same boat.
What would relieve the overcrowding at Sistering?
More shelter space and affordable housing.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Wong Tam. Any other questions for the deputant? Thank you very much. Brian DeMatos. Brian DeMatos. Debbie O'Kane. Debbie O'Kane. Patricia O'Connell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm the executive director at Sistering, and Kathy showed the picture earlier of All Saints. The picture we have up now is Moss Park Armories. And I just wanted, particularly, Mr. Chair, to your questions to Kathy, which I thought were a bit chastising of her to push to get the armories open. If you look at this, and you look at the picture we had from St. Margaret's, anyone would choose this, even if it's only for a week. And the people that use the drop-ins in the shelters, their lives are terribly chaotic. If they could get that space, as I said, for a week or a day or a month and have to move to All Saints, they'd do it in a minute. And in fact, people travel from drop-in to drop-in, shelter to shelter, in part because of what Dana says. When you're elbow to elbow, you get on each other's nerves, and someone decides to take a break. We have a woman I've talked to at some committees, 79 years old, has lived on the street for the last 2.5 years. She comes to Sistering, she sleeps on 3 kitchen chairs, and she does that. She used to do it for several weeks at a time. Now she can only really manage it for a week at a time, and then she goes to Women's Res or Evangeline. She gets tired of them, she comes back, she goes to Adelaide. I don't know about the men's sector, but the women move around because they form relationships, and then they get in spats with each other, then they separate for a while and they come back. But honest to goodness, if you had that facility, I mean, people would think it's nirvana. I love Sistering. I think it's fabulous. I think we do a great job. But as Dana said, people live cheek by jowl all the time, day in and day out. And at night, when you roll over on the floor, you're running into someone else. So that is heaven. And for a day or 2 days, everyone would choose to go there if they could get there. I just wanted to explain really what the lives are like, and I can't explain it because it's not my life, but I see the effect. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Any questions for the deputy? Councillor Cressy, then Councillor Mahavik, and Councillor Fletcher.
Patricia, thank you for being here. You've been a regular participant over the last couple of years. I want to take a step back and not get into the nitty-gritty. You were a senior public servant here at the city,
Yes.
working at Parks, Forestry, and Rec for years, and a couple of years ago, I know you moved into the shelter sector at Sistering. So I guess the question is to take a step back, not to get into the policy weeds. I'd ask, sitting in our chair or sitting in our city staff's chair, how should we approach this beyond emergency respite spaces, improved quality, transitional and supportive housing, all the permanent housing? Just how would you approach this? You've been on our side of the table before.
I think, first of all, I'd get the various departments involved together and come up with a plan that everyone could play their part in. I think the suggestion of a united voice from the city going to the province, going to the feds, FMC, FCM, as the former Councillor Layton did. I think in his time he was very effective at making the Canada-wide connections for these kinds of problems. I think the city has to start, and I think it's starting, so over the last few months there's been a change, to have one voice speaking to the different levels of government, and it has to be all 3 working on this problem together. I can't imagine it's just a Toronto problem. I believe it's a nation's problem.
Now, your advice then around, because we have representatives here from a lot of different departments and divisions who I can attest over the last month have been an all-hands-on-deck approach. I guess in citing permanent shelter sites, the role of all different departments and thinking outside of the box and more creatively. Do you see that as a role, having been at PF&R, for example, in your past?
After my experience here, I could see lots, just on that department, lots of areas where Parks and Rec could play a role. Anecdotally, in the olden days, when we had this crisis, we have heated field houses. They're heated all winter, and so I brought a report to council to say, let's open up the field house so people are not going to die. The city solicitor had a major conniption, wrote a report, absolutely in no circumstances can you do this. Council opened it up. And for that winter, we had people staying in field houses. It wasn't ideal, they didn't have the supports, but nobody died. And that was, well, I won't say how long ago.
I mean, I think, and just, I guess I would just put it as a final question here. We've talked about the more systemic housing solutions across all levels of government, but as we look to next winter, understanding the strain of some of the drop-in and respite providers, given that some of them, like yourselves, are not city-run, should we think creatively next winter? If we don't have enough permanent beds open, that at least we're not scrambling to try to deal with the drop-in situation.
I think so. I think you need to plan now, and I think with due respect to the city and city staff, community agencies run these programs at less cost than it costs the city itself to run them.
Right.
And so I would be devolving drop-ins and shelters to the sector, just for staff costs alone, if nothing else, and that will save a fair bit of money. And we need to have a plan. Like this winter was bad, or is bad, and we were all playing catch-up together to try to solve a problem that, quite frankly, we came to Budget Committee last year to say this is going to be a problem, and we only recently got attention.
Thank you, Patricia.
Thank you, Councillor Cressy. Councillor Wong-Tam, and then, no, Councillor Wong-Tam?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, Patricia, I wanted to ask a question regarding the standards, because it sounds to me that, number one, sistering is full.
Yes.
At capacity. You don't want to turn people away. Kathy mentioned creating standards for the warming respites, for the drop-in centers, probably for the out of the code, because we've heard about some of the conditions there. You would welcome standards?
Well, what the city staff encourage us to do, and we try to as best we can, adhere to the existing shelter standards. Now, we don't, obviously, because we can't, but there's certain areas of the shelter standards that we can follow, and we try to do that.
Can you give me examples of the shelter standards that are transferable to the drop-in standards that you've been asked to comply with?
They can't be directly transferred, no, because there's capacity issues and all kinds of things that we couldn't meet.
Are they cleaning and staffing standards?
Yes, they have those type of standards, yes.
How do you clean the facility when there's always people there? Like, how do you mop the floor? How do you do
we have,
like that?
I think we've got a couple of creative ways. We have an all-female cleaning company that we hired, and first thing in the morning, we move people from a third of the space all to one end, and then the cleaners go in there and clean and disinfect that area. Then people move back, and then we do it in sections, move people around, and then they come back. They do that at 9 o'clock in the morning, and then they come back in the 8 o'clock at night, do the offices, and then they do the drop-in, a thorough clean before people put the mats down.
And so when shelters, and many of them don't have day programs, and so they're inviting their guests to leave because it's time for them to clean, but yet you've managed to clean your facility without kicking anybody out onto the street, queuing up outside of your facility while you clean.
Yeah. It's doable.
It's doable. So I guess it's just, I want to make a note that it is doable without asking people to leave the shelters during the day.
Yeah.
Because they don't come back until it's supper time.
That's right. And we have a shelter close to us, and the women sleep there, and they spend their day and evening at Sistering.
And is that because they're closed during the day?
Yes.
Cleaning?
Whatever, I don't know.
Whatever.
Yeah.
Okay. What's the longest stay that one of your guests have had since you've become a 24-hour drop-in facility?
I'm sorry, I missed the question.
What's the longest duration of stay that one of your women have had? Maybe.
We have one woman that's been there 2 years. A year is not exceptional, and this is till people get some kind of housing. 6 to 9 months, maybe an average stay. So again, it's a mat on the floor, but.
Yeah, so for 6 to 9 months, no privacy, no ability to put their belongings down, really, because they got to carry it with them.
Yeah.
Where they don't have a guaranteed spot when they move from their place on the floor.
Yeah.
How many showers do you have?
We have one shower.
And how many guests do you have currently staying at your facility?
Overnight or through the day? Overnight, we have between, usually around 50, and it goes between 50 and 65, 67. And during the day, there's several hundred people that go through.
Several hundred people?
We serve lunch of around 350, 400 people.
How many washrooms do you have?
3 on the drop-in floor, 3 regular ones and 1 disabled washroom.
Yeah, so they're basically pedestal washing area plus a bathroom, a toilet.
No.
Correct?
I mean, not that I have any objection to the discussion about washrooms, but I don't know how that's pertinent to policymaking.
Yeah, no, Chair, I just wanted to highlight, I guess, and understand for myself, because I didn't realize that you had several hundred people drop in during the day. I knew about the numbers of 50 and 60. So I'm actually learning a few things as I ask these questions. So that's fine, but thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome.
Any other questions, including questions about washrooms? Councillor Fletcher.
I did see you nodding when I was talking earlier about including zoning and asking that would you be able and willing and interested in making sure that there's a lot of voices to say we need a really good method of inclusionary zoning. Have you had a chance to read that legislation?
I haven't read the legislation. However, inclusionary zoning, I think, is absolutely necessary.
Have you read the proposal from the province?
No.
So it would be helpful if you had something new what that was supposed to be. Would you be surprised to know that any housing, the city would have to cover 40% of the cost of building any of the new units?
Well, I think that the cost has to be spread across the 3 levels of government.
How about for the developer, just the developer?
I'm sorry?
So the inclusionary zoning with 80 stories of that I thought that the community ask would probably be that the developer would have to deliver a certain number of units at their own cost in order to get that extra density.
Right.
Because the zoning isn't for 80 stories. However, the new legislation indicates that in order to have any of these new affordable units baked in, that the city would have to give up its Section 37 request and pay the developer to build. Does that seem logical to you?
It doesn't. When you were talking, I was thinking that the Section 37 needed to be modified to include some housing, as there's not any space for parks anywhere anymore.
Yeah, well, we have cash for parks, but for extra density and bonusing, I think I'd like to hear from the community. It is a bonus. The zoning is 30 meters, and now you're at 60 meters. Is there not some benefit that the community should get for that housing itself within this amount?
Absolutely.
Without cost? Or federal government money, or the city certainly can't undertake?
No, the city can't do it. The city can't do it. I mean,
I'd appreciate if you have a look at some of that and give us your best thoughts on
I
it.
would imagine the developers are making a fair bit of profit, and maybe the profit margins need to be shaved a bit. But You know, no one's going to live in a city if they're tripping over bodies on the street.
That's right. Thank you. It's true. Quality of life for everybody.
Thank you, Councillor Fletcher. Councillor Mahavik, who's been waiting patiently.
Thank you. I think I had my hand up first. You were here in November.
Yes. I
And,
came to your Board of Health. I came to this
Yep.
one. I came to Exact. I
Yeah,
came
it's
to
always great to
council.
see you, Patricia.
I miss city.
Yeah, okay. And at that time, if I remember right, you had, you have an occupancy for overnight of
50.
50, and if I remember right, you were taking in something like 75. The number 79 sticks in my
67.
67.
Yep.
And that was in November. And I know that there were some attempts, or I heard tell of some attempts to have some folks who were in with sistering regularly to move them into supportive housing units or into housing units. How did that go, and what's your number now?
Our numbers have not changed. They're the same. But what has happened, because of the motel program, people from women's residence have been moved into motels. And when that first happened, Women's Res offered us 10 spots. So we were able to move 10 of our women there, but 10 more came in. So it's moved some of our long-term people into shelter, but the numbers haven't decreased.
I see. So if you use the image of a pipe, 10 went out this way, but there's such a backlog out there that 10 immediately filled in.
Yeah. Like when you were talking about the numbers of people, we haven't really talked much here, but women's homelessness is different than men's. So you have women couch surfing, or as Dana's saying, she often has people in her room because there's no place for them to go. And so that happens a lot at Sistering. If someone has a spot, they often invite people to come and stay, not for a long time, but to get a break from the space. You'll find lots and lots of women couch surfing or sleeping on someone's floor.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome.
Great, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Questions for staff? Councillor Wong-Tam.
Yes, thank you very much, Chair. I want to ask staff about the intake process. When someone walks through the Better Living Center, the Armory, the 24-hour respite, any of the warming centers, what type of intake process is there, and is it consistent from those facilities to the out of the code to the permanent shelter beds? And then where does all that information go, and how do you track it and monitor it moving forward?
Through the chair. So through the broader shelter system, it is standardized in Smiths. In the low barrier locations, there is an abbreviated process for that. So there is an intake process. Fred Victor is trialing an electronic version of that currently, and at the other locations, they're doing what they've done for some time, which is to document it on paper and then upload the information, at the end of the day.
And so the Fred Victor program that's just being, I guess, developed, that tells me that perhaps there's a need to modify and improve a system. Is that why it's being done?
Yeah, so one of the goals that we've been focused on this year is the better collection of data, not just in terms of data points, but how we collect it electronically. So this is sort of a first look. Mark was interested in trialing that with us in one of the low barrier locations. And so we're doing the same with street outreach, moving from pen and paper to mobile collection of information.
And is that because you were trying to develop a case management system where it follows the individual, as opposed to having that record stay at a brick and mortar facility?
Through the chair. So a couple of things is to improve the collection of data for certain, and we are working with Toronto Alliance to End Homelessness to try and figure out how we can refine a unique identifier system. So we do ask people for their names and those sort of things currently, and many people give us those things, but it is a very sensitive issue about the identification of individuals in the system. So we're trying to improve the collection of information so that we can better understand how to serve the client population.
So I was informed recently by a federal representative that the City of Toronto was one of the few jurisdictions across the country that did not have a depopulation strategy for the housing, through the housing sector, and that we were, out of all the municipalities across the country, the only one that was growing the shelter system and not being able to move them into transitional housing. How would you respond to that suggestion?
Through the chair, so Toronto has some unique challenges that it faces. I would argue that Toronto is a leader in this area. And so in many ways, though, we're not comparable to some places. So a good example was Hamilton was brought up as the great work that they're doing there. And Hamilton is doing great work. But their program is almost identical to what we do here in Toronto. But the uniqueness of the community there is quite different. So if you look at their pit count in 2016, it was 504. In Toronto in 2015, it was over 5,000. The vacancy rate there is 2.5%. In Toronto, it's 1%. And by CMHC, actually looking at a market analysis of available units, the cost was $1,050 for a one-bedroom. In Toronto, it's $2,020. The affordability factors are quite different. It is a very complex issue. There may be some additional resources there as well that the organization, has not continued to build over time. But Toronto's programs are focused on eviction prevention, housing first. There is obviously the large shelter system that requires additional attention, and also the moving folks out into housing.
Every single speaker today has raised the issue of needing more shelter beds, more wraparound services for those who are actually in the shelters and the drop-in facilities, needing permanent and supportive housing, the plethora and the range of housing. And yet we also know that the provincial and federal government are largely partners that have to come to the table. Can you just highlight for me, if we were able to have this conversation with the provincial and federal partners today, do we have in place a justifiable plan asking for X number of units and results that we need to see in terms of their participation through funding or management or what have you?
Last question.
Yes,
over 5 minutes.
And it's an important one. This is the one that you'll like, Chair.
I wouldn't doubt it.
And will this plan be quantifiable with enough disaggregated data behind it so you can justify the need that there are some things that they are just falling short on in their delivery of funding for the city to action out into service? Do you have that ready?
So through the chair, the organization does have the service plan. We are meeting as a city with many divisions in the development of a new housing plan for the coming decade that is happening right now. And we have deep connections with the province and the federal government talking to them about these very serious issues.
In development, the plan.
So we're required to develop a new plan for the coming decade, and we are doing that currently. But we do have an existing service plan that covers these issues.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Wong-Tam. Councillor Havoc, and then Councillor Cressy.
Thank you. Just 2 questions, because I know we've had lots of conversations in the past several weeks. One is, does our computer system track, is there a screen that someone at Central Intake or at Peter Street for the drop-ins can look at that basically says, okay, we have 3 beds here on a real-time basis? I know with Phil Brown, we spent a lot of money developing something, and I'm wondering is that what we developed? I thought that's what we were developing.
So through the chair, yes, we do have a system. System has been in place for some time, and I would argue that we're in the process of working through updating the system to make it better. It is imperfect, I would say. But yes, we can look in real time to see what the vacancies are. Part of the issue with that to consider is, like a hospital, the beds come open and close regularly through the 24-hour period. And so at a point in time, you will see something closed, something open, something closed, which is the management that people talk about at Peter Street for looking through the system for individual needs and then finding a location. Okay, that all being said, the system is very busy, and it's at 95% capacity. So when you're looking at 63 small locations around the city, it's dynamic and changes all the time.
But a frontline worker at Covenant House would not have access to that screen and would not know that, these 20 locations are absolutely totally full, and they may be kind of chasing their tail, no? If they don't know which ones are full and which ones might have spaces.
Yeah, so they can look at the screen at Covenant House. But you have to, if you're going to send somebody to a bed, then you have to book that bed and hold it. So at individual locations, they're working with Peter Street and within the system to make sure that a bed is available, and you don't send someone somewhere and they show up and then the bed has already been taken.
So if John Doe goes to Peter Street or any place else, we don't ask any health data, or we don't do any health assessment, and we don't do currently any other demographic data. Male, 55, these are his or her ailments, this is a region of Toronto of origin, they might be coming from Rexdale, they might be coming from downtown Toronto. Is any of that data collected? To be able to do good casework, you need that data.
So through the chair, there is quite a bit of data that's collected. Healthcare data, I would say no, that's not the case. And when the individual then gets into casework and case management, there are deeper dives into that particular piece. Obviously, we are strong proponents for more healthcare in the shelter system. So in a unique place like Seton House, there is all kinds of healthcare going on there, and healthcare case management with the physicians and nurses that work there through St. Mike's.
And that would be a growing edge, would it not be, where if I go to, I don't know, just because the sistering and then I go to another place, that it would be good to respect privacy issues, of course, but at the same time be able to transfer that so that there's a continuity of care, especially if they are highly mobile clients.
Yeah, so we get into very deep privacy issues around healthcare information. So that is something that we've been talking to the LHIN about. But yeah, with healthcare workers working with other healthcare workers in the continuum of that care, just like in a hospital, you would be able to transfer with consent information to make sure that you follow that patient's care.
Okay, thank you very much.
Councillor Cressy.
Thank you. And first of all, just to our GM first, Paul, to you and your team, thank you for the work that's been done over the last month and a half. I know it has been a lot of work. The first question is just related to the period after April 15th, is if there's council direction to seek to have spaces continue to be open to ensure that we are as close as possible to that 90% target on a respite or drop-in capacity, is that something that through your division and support you think we'll be able to do?
Through the chair, it's probably early to give you a definitive answer. I can tell you that we will do everything possible to make that happen. Much of the service that's provided is not provided by the city, it's provided by other agencies and organizations. So those things require consent, board approvals, all of those types of things. But of course, if we receive that direction, as when we receive direction for any of the pieces, we do everything we can to make it happen.
Thank you. I want to transition to some questions around sort of the Housing First approach and then to some questions related to the budget. First, on sort of the overall continuum of housing, do we have access to supportive housing? So when we're dealing with our more than 6,000 people who are using the range of services through SSHA you provide, do we have access to supportive housing so that we can make those transitions?
Yeah, through the chair. So there's really very little access to supportive housing, and I mean that's evidenced in the emergency shelter system. 10% of our users use 60% of the bed nights in the emergency shelter system, and that is because there is really nowhere for those individuals to go. So the organization, and this is not seen. There's 19,000 people that actually roll through the system every year. 2/3 or more of those people are with us for less than 3 months. And they receive assistance from all of the different folks working within the sector, and they get back and out of the emergency shelter system. But there is a core group of people who require very deep supportive housing, and that is just not available to them right now.
And who would make it available?
Through the chair, so that would be a combination of the provincial government and possibly the federal government, and in working with the city.
So one of the requests in the open letter, and which will be formally tabled here as a motion by Councillor Wong-Tam, is at our meeting in February, in addition to what we've talked about, the immediate steps now after April 15th, to do a deep dive into the supportive housing framework, the permanent beds, all of those. Would you be able to have the answers to the questions of the funding framework, how many supportive housing beds are available, what the province is doing, what we can be doing? Can we have that discussion in a concerted level in February?
Through the chair, I think we can have an initial discussion. I think we should be cautious to note that we have some fairly basic information at our fingertips, and I think one of the things that our team really wants to do is to improve our ability to really look at information and so that we can have better conversations. But certainly we can have an initial discussion about that, absolutely.
I want to, in my time left, transition a little bit to the dollars and cents here, because how we allocate our funds is a reflection of the priorities of decision makers, those being the government here. So how many new full-time employees has the Shelter Support and Housing Administration Department, how many new employees have you had in the last 10 years? Like, how many employees do we have today compared to 10 years ago?
Through the chair, the FTE count in this area has remained the same for the last 10 years.
For the last 10 years, Shelter Support and Housing Administration has had the same number of full-time staff.
Through the chair, specifically speaking on the homeless file, on the social housing file, I would have to look at that. I think there has been some increase on the social housing side.
Has there been an increase in homelessness in the last 10 years?
Through the chair, yes.
Okay. This council has let you down, sir. You don't have to answer that. When adjusted to inflation, has Shelter Support and Housing Administration's budget gone up or down in the last 10 years?
So for this budget cycle, it is going up. But when we look at the numbers over the last 10 years, they've remained about the same, not adjusted to inflation.
And when adjusted to inflation?
Well, I guess if an economist was looking at that, then in real dollars,
it's gone
down in the last 10 years.
I apologize. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Cressy. Councillor Fletcher?
Yes. Oh, here we go. I was quite taken, as you all know, I love charts and I like numbers. So with the chart that A.J. Withers handed in today that has the estimated number of emergency shelter, it just has the number of beds and the usage and everything. Would you say that the numbers that are in here are correct, or you'd like to answer that when you come back in February, if this motion passes for February the 28th?
Yeah, through the chair, so when the individual numbers look about right.
So you'd be able to comment more on this when, I know that Councillor Wong-Tam, there's a motion here today to look at what we're doing. So we could actually break these down a little bit, number of beds in the system and where those shelters are located, who's operating them, those kinds of things. I'm expecting that that's something that we'll kind of get a full briefing on in February. So that those would all add up then to 5,896 or close beds.
Through the chair, that is correct.
And have you had a chance to look at that motion that's been pre-circulated and that letter that was signed and the asks for February the 28th?
Through the chair, yes.
And you're able to give us that pretty close view of the circumstances that would be quite related to a number of these issues on here for permanent beds and as well for temporary beds, emergency beds.
Through the chair, that's correct. I think I should just, in terms of calculation, we would have to look exactly at that, but the individual lines outside of the total is, look correct to us.
So in the totals of the number of beds, then the emergency uses, the drop-ins, et cetera, and then we have the overnight winter at 713. So I think that it would be, I'd like to be able to dive into this a little bit deeper in February, assume that motion passes, but also to say I'm quite interested in digging down into some of these, including beds in the system, ones that have closed, ones coming on stream, replacement, relocation, new, et cetera.
Through the chair, yeah.
That's what we'll be able to do then. That's great. And so the other thing then is, I was going to ask about your budget requirements, but Councillor Cressy beat me to that. Do you have any estimate of federal and provincial dollars, what the influx that we'd like to see from those two levels of government in order to have a robust system for temporary as well as for our permanent beds or transitional beds, our first steps to homes beds?
Through the chair, I would not have an estimate of that today.
In that depth, did you say, or of those beds?
Just in terms of what's required from the other levels of government, I wouldn't be able to provide a number today.
Today, but maybe on the 28th of February when we're looking, we could say that.
We'll try and give our best range.
Yeah, I'm not looking for exact dollars. I'm kind of looking for range of what's missing from funding and understanding that the province has put a cap. Is that correct?
So through the chair, that's correct. There was a per diem model that ended in 2012, and now it is a capped model.
Right, so it's been capped for how many years?
Since 2012, so I don't know if it's exactly 5 years, but in that range.
So if I was to ask you if it wasn't capped, what would that shortfall be based on what we're doing today versus what we could have done or what we are doing and scrambling? Would you be able to come up with that number, at least kind of hardcore number 4 years later, 5 years later?
Through the chair,
6 years later.
We would be able to do that. Today, we could say that, you know, as volume rose, then in a previous model, you would see additional funding with that.
So we had a cap, we've had extra volume, doing more, and we have, basically, we should be sending an invoice up to Queen's Park, and it's meant that we have not been able to do as much as we'd like to do, that we see conditions that we've seen today. I'm not going to make my speech now, but I really would like to have that number. I think the public needs to know that number, because you would agree with me that there has been, and I don't know if your department has received any, but quite an outpouring from Torontonians about concern for those who are homeless over this last period of time. Have you received any
Absolutely,
calls?
we absolutely see that.
You've received calls and people very concerned and wanting to help and wanting to make sure this is looked after.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your work.
Thank you, Councillor Fletcher. I just have a couple of quick questions. I guess the cautionary tale about using third-party facilities, such as federal facilities, is you can't control when you take possession and when you have to leave. Is it correct that we have to depart the Armory by January the 29th, sorry.
Through the chair, that's correct.
And one of the motions before us is asking for an extension. What is the likelihood that the federal authorities will agree?
I'm not sure I can answer that question. I can say that the federal government was very clear on the 29th date.
So the people who are currently in the Armory, they have to be repositioned elsewhere. What's the plan there?
That's correct. So the province has provided 354 George Street. They're working currently with our team on the facilities management side to ensure that that location is ready to go. It is a location that will have at least 100 spaces available, and we're also looking at another location in the event that we need that.
Mm-hmm. So would it be safe to assume that we're going to, if we can't extend that agreement, we're going to be causing, I guess, dozens of homeless people more anxiety and grief? We have to somehow move them elsewhere. They have to start over.
So the plan is on January 29th to move to 354 George Street from the Armories.
Okay, fair enough. When it comes to medical attention and medical intervention, how do we understand a homeless person's medical history in order to help them in any way? Do we do sort of a physical? Do we have GPs on site that could come and do an examination? Do we take blood work? What degree of medical intervention is available on site?
So I'd say generally throughout the shelter system, the amazing people there do their best to ensure that people get medical attention through, the hospital system, the healthcare system. Generally, there is not, a high degree of healthcare support within the emergency shelter system. There are a couple of locations, such as Seton House, that have dedicated teams of physicians and nurses that come in and do intensive case management, that those programs were funded historically for specific reasons. But in general terms, there is a real gap there within the emergency shelter system. Chris Brillinger and his team and my team and others are working closely with the LHIN to do our best to get more health care into the emergency shelter system. So that work is ongoing at the moment.
Now we have a universal single-payer system. So anybody, if we find a doctor, maybe a Doctors Without Borders concept, a group of doctors who can work in the shelters, they would still be able to, I guess if some of our clients or residents have OHIP cards, still bill back accordingly the way your family GP would?
So the model at Seton House is a good model. Intercity Health team, associates, they work out of St. Mike's. There is funding from the Ministry of Health to provide specific care to clients of Seton House. So the funding is there, and I can't give you the exact breakdown of how they work that funding model, but it seems to work well.
Last question. When a person with no fixed address passes away in a local hospital, do we consider that a homeless death?
So yes, Mr. Chair, we do. So you had asked some questions. If I can just round out and expand a little further, you had asked some questions around the reporting of homeless deaths. That is an initiative that Toronto Public Health started in January of 2017. And it actually requires the participation of over 200 communities and social service agencies to help us find out, have there been deaths amongst our homeless and underhoused population? And we seek to get as much information around the circumstances of those deaths so that we can better understand what some of the circumstances are and then come up with solutions in partnership with whether it's SSHA, other city divisions, LHIN partners, and healthcare partners.
So if they pass away in a hospital, if they pass away in a shelter or even in a private home or what have you, that is considered a homeless fatality.
Yes, that's correct. And in fact, to the extent that we're able to get that information, that's one of the data pieces that we collect. Where is the death believed to have occurred?
Okay. All right, thank you very much. Speakers, and I have a pile of motions here. So now, Councillor Wong Tam is first because you're moving the main package, and then I believe there's an amendment to come from Councillor Mahavik. So, Councillor Wong Tam, would you like to lead off?
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And the clerks have put the motion on the screen. I'm sorry that it's so lengthy in word, but hopefully I believe that after a lot of consultation and speaking with a number of the colleagues, and also incorporating some of the recommendations from the speakers, we're going to get to a good place. Number one is the City Council reconfirm is 90% shelter occupancy. For the record, because it's important to state our values, let's do it one more time. We did it in 1999, 2001, 2002, 2003, 2013, and we're going to do it again in 2018. Request the federal government to provide ongoing access and support in retaining the operation of the Moss Park Armory. I recognize that there might be some difficulty with that with the federal government, but I think as Kathy Crow has rightly stated, if you don't ask, then you won't know. So it's okay if they say no to us. I think it's just very important as this order of government, we stand up for the residents of Toronto and say, please consider it. Two is also to request the federal government to consider uploading or sharing some of the costs, operations, and management of housing and shelter-related services as it relates to specialized populations that the Government of Canada could be responsible for and are responsible for, such as veterans, Indigenous populations, as well as asylum seekers and refugees. Again, it's just starting the conversation and putting it all on the table. Also to request that we retain the operations and the necessary respite centers, the warming centers, the drop-in facilities beyond the scheduled closing date of April the 15th. I know that staff have done a phenomenal job of getting these facilities open. This has been a very difficult winter. When I say that the workers of Fred Victor didn't necessarily have a holiday break, I'm sure you and the frontline staff at SSAJ did not have a holiday break, and I want to just acknowledge that. In the middle of a crisis, in the middle of an emergency, I think we're just going to have to dig deeper right now and see if we can do the very best we can and extend those facilities, because having 700 people who's sleeping rough right now, vicariously dropped onto the streets by way of us closing those facilities is just not on, not when we know that we're willingly doing it. And two is to work with the operators of the Out of the Cold program. There may be some that are not that are ready to close up sooner rather than later. I understand it's been a very difficult winter for them, but let's see if there are some that may have the volunteer and the staffing capacity that could perhaps stay open longer. And again, this is not a demand, but rather just simply a request with our community partners out there. Given the state of winter readiness, I want us to be even better prepared next time round. I think that the report that came to the last CDR meeting was rather late in the season, as we voted on some of those works, some of the work in at the end of 2018. Let's start that work now. And you already have a plan. Let's see if we can improve it. Taking on the recommendation of Kathy Crow is to also develop immediate service and maintenance standards for the respite centers, 24-hour drop-ins, warming facilities, I think, and the Out of the Cold programs. I think we can all agree the images that were shown on the screen are just not acceptable. Those open spaces around plumbing, the cheek-to-jowl resting space on the floors is not safe. It's not hygienic, and it's actually certainly not humane. And I think we can do better. And I like the idea of having the Toronto Board of Health perhaps provide some oversight to make sure those standards are met. How it's going to be actioned out, I think we can have that further discussion, dialogue later on. And then to make sure that everything happens with a budget item, because all of this request would make no sense and it won't happen without some budget allocations in 2018. Also to request that, this has been a big focal point of everybody who has spoken today, is to make sure that the Ministry of Health and the TC LINs will work with us immediately to develop, in consultation with the service providers, a comprehensive funded plan to make sure that proper, adequate mental health supports as well as health supports and harm reduction services are available to those who need them wherever they may be. And that includes the population as currently underserved in the drop-in and warming centers. And then finally, actually not finally, but moving forward and is to have all of that reported back to us at this committee in February 2018. February 28, 2018. So we'll have this discussion again in about 1 month. What was also made evidently clear is that we probably don't have as much data as we need, and this is actually very crucial for us moving forward. So the first request that I'd like to put on the table, and this is again in consultation and dialogue with a number of the members that are here, is I want us to put in 1,000 plus at a minimum, new permanent shelter beds into the system. I don't think that we can start with a smaller number. It may grow from there, but let's start at the very least with the 1,000. We also need to know the number of real permanent shelter beds in Toronto. We need to have a fuller understanding of the number of motel beds, hotel beds, and then who's staying in them besides the category of families. We need to have proper accounting of the population that we are trying to serve and reach out to. I also want to have a better understanding of replacement beds that have come online versus those that are brand new shelters, because too often, for example, we celebrated the
You could wrap up your closing in on 6 minutes.
It's just a very long motion, Chair, and if I can just ask for
We can
indulgence.
read.
I won't speak after this.
We can read it.
This is it. Yes, you can. Of course you can. But,
I'll ask
okay.
her a question.
Yeah, there might be questions for the mover.
Sure.
Okay, I got a
That's
question of the
fine.
mover. Question of the mover.
Yes, Councillor Mahavik.
Is there anything else you'd like to say?
You know what? Those are nuisance questions.
No, but
You have something specific?
if she's got a long motion, like give her the courtesy of finishing it so that she does it once and don't interrupt her, and then you don't have these nuisance questions. Respectfully.
I'll try to
We'll allow the nuisance question.
I'm hoping that's going to provide information and just some clarity, because I think it's very important that we're all just trying to get to a place of having enough data. And what we've heard now from frontline workers and other folks is that they would love to be able to have a centralized, I mean, there is a centralized intake system, but I don't think it's working as well as it can. And just as much as our general manager has said there are modifications to be made, I would like to put a challenge out there to say that perhaps we need to do more than just modify. Maybe what we need is a brand new system that is going to be open data in real time, where it's accessible and still be able to manage the privacy issues that we have to manage, and then track that as that individual who is highly mobile moves from facility to facility so it doesn't get lost. And the rest of it I won't get into, because it really does speak to supportive housing and making sure that we bring our provincial and federal partners to the table, and also asking the fact that when they come to the table, we're going to, before we speak to them, but we need to have some very clear detailed accounting of what have they done for us so far. Because in my conversations with MPPs and MPs, they say that they've done plenty. Toronto's gotten so much, but they're also telling me that we're taking their money and suppressing their tax, the property tax rate. So they're actually suggesting that we haven't used their money very wisely. So let's demonstrate if that's true, and I would like to see that myself. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much for that moving address. Councillor Mahavik.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. First, I'll be supporting Councillor Wong-Tam's motion, and I want to say the following things. First, I am thankful to the advocates, to the frontline workers, to civil society for the last month and the advocacy. Yes, it has been a little bit of a bump and grind, and I've been at the tail end of some, what I would say is perhaps disagreements on tactics and strategy, but please rest assured that it was all towards a goal of having the strongest possible shelter system and the strongest possible supportive and transitional housing system.
Just a reminder, you've got 3 motions.
Yes, and I will
move them?
get to them. I will get to them if you just allow me to do them in my way. I'll move them, and then I'll get to them in due course. So I'm thankful to them. I'm also thankful to staff. One of the regrets, I think, of the last month and a half has been that they sometimes have been pictured as the enemy or certainly not understanding things. And it is my experience that they totally understand and that they are working in with very limited resources, trying to do the best that they can. And I am thankful. I'm thankful that they're there. I find them totally committed to the task at hand and totally supportive. And I think we in Toronto owe them also supportive encouragement. What I see here, frankly, and I think the deputants all spoke to it from different perspectives, is a great big broad systems failure. Failures at the federal level, at the provincial level, in the health care, in the housing supports, in the housing system, in the shelter system, with the tax rate, and here at the city that is driving all these cuts and has been driving them for 20 years, and that this is the thing that we need to turn around. I also think that right now, because of the way this has kind of developed, this is a moment of a grand opportunity for us to get some good things done. And it comes because of the public attention, because of the social media, because of the coldest winter to date in a long time. All of these things come together. We've got people's attention, and we should grab it and seize it ferociously. The motions are as follows, and they are in addition to Councillor Wong Tam's motions. First, this is the refugees, seeing that I was for the last couple of years the refugee advocate. To look at, and I know staff are doing this affirms that work that they are doing. When you consider that we have 29% of our shelter users are refugee claimants, or soon-to-be refugee claimants, it's almost like we need a separate or a sub-separate system here, linked to refugee lawyers, and appropriate supports that are different than the supports from the, call it, regular shelter users. Right now, the way our system is that it is our staff that make the agreements with the motels and hotels. It would just be so much smarter for us to say, okay, there are X number of refugee-serving agencies. We should at least pass the contracts through them and allow them to set up homes, to set up apartments, to set up more norms so they could do their own cooking, so that they can be linked to lawyers and to legal aid and the support services that they need as refugees to start their claimant process. So that's what that motion tries to do. So I hope you can support that. The second one is this, and the key word there, B, is the word third party. You know, it is one thing for the general manager of SSHA to say, you know what, I can't do it all. It is another thing for us to say, and I think we all heard him say very clearly, that his system has grown by 30%, depending on how you count, up to 50% bigger, and the cases are more complex, and he has less staff to deal with it, less money, even when adjusted for inflation, to deal with the issues at hand. And I hear it from frontline workers. I've talked to a lot of them in the last little while. It's everything from management to food staff to cleaners to client services. They just can't do it. And we need an honest review of the resources that are necessary to carry this shelter system over the next little while. and a third party can do it, so it's not him seeing, or it's not Paul Raftis seeing that he's feathering his own departmental nest, but that it is an honest review that we will have to deal with honestly as City Council. And of course, Council will have the right to say no, but it needs the facts. It needs the facts. So that's what that tries to do. And then that also looks at training standards and upgrades as required. And then the third piece is an ode to Councillor Wong Tam's motion of an analysis of the number of transitional and supportive housing units required to accommodate residents in shelter, and that really is part of the both end. We need to do the shelter analysis work, and we also need to look at the transitional and supportive housing work. We do have a priority in our housing waiting list for people who are palliative or near the end of their life, for people who are struggling with violence against women, who are in that, deemed to be in that category. They get a bump up in terms of affordable housing units. But we need to figure this out. This has been an issue for like 10 years, 20 years. Frankly, since the deinstitutionalization of folks, frankly, in the mid-1990s. So to try to get a handle on what the numbers are and to also put it in the context of all the other pressures that we have on our housing system, that's what this motion tries to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Mihevc. I have Councillor Cressy next, and then Councillor Fletcher.
Well, thank you, Chair, and I will be supporting the motions that have been presented. I have a very short motion as well, if it can be put on the screen, which is simply to request that we have Lynn in the province here to join in the presentation at that meeting next month so that we can ask both, and I've spoken with the DCM about this. Let me begin my remarks by thanking our City of Toronto staff, who are exceptional city employees. I know this has been an exceptionally difficult period, most particularly for those who are homeless and those living rough on the streets. We recognize that. It has also been for those who are thankful to have a comfortable room over their heads, but are nonetheless working tirelessly. And this has been a particularly difficult period for them. And I want to thank our city staff. I want to thank our frontline providers and experts. We heard from many of them here today for, I think, helping to bring the eyes of Torontonians into the shelter and housing crisis. Torontonians are deeply caring and empathetic people, but I think it was this winter, for the first time in some time, that Torontonians have had the opportunity to truly understand the state of this crisis, which is indeed a crisis and an emergency, and I think our frontline experts and providers have much we should be thankful to them for that. Listen, demand is growing on our shelter system. We know that. It is caused by a myriad of factors, from poverty to global instability to the strained rental housing market, all of the above. The bottom line is the situation is untenable, it's not livable, and as a city, as a province, as a country, doing as well as we are, when you have a situation of this dire circumstance for so many, I think it can easily be said that we're actually not doing well. In fact, we're failing. And so Councillor Wong Tam's motion that I was part of the open letter released yesterday, and I was proud to have played a very tiny part in, I think helps on a number of fronts. It helps in the immediate and short term to ensure that not only do we seek to improve the current emergency situation we have, but also to keep those spaces, the emergency spaces, open after the 15th, and to seek to improve them. That's a good starting point. I think and then as soon as possible, I don't want to even say medium term and long term, as soon as possible, to build the adequate new permanent shelter beds. And I say adequate as in places that have a dignified place for people to stay, and alongside that to ensure that the proper wraparound supports, the health supports, the mental health supports, the harm reduction supports are in place, and as soon as possible to ensure that we are actually building, we being the city, the province, and the feds, the transitional and supportive housing and permanent housing, so that we don't have a housing model based on a shelter model. It should be a housing model with shelter there. I would just close, I'm not going to use my full 5 minutes, which is to say that this crisis was predicted. In fact, I think it was created. because show me your budget and I'll tell you what your priorities are. And every government, every level of government created this crisis. Everyone. The province, absolutely they've failed. The federal government, they may talk about a national housing strategy now, but where were they when they created this? And the city. We've had homelessness growing for 10 years. The budget for the shelter division has gone down, not up when adjusted to inflation for 10 years. The number of staff working in the shelter division on homelessness has not increased in 10 years. Every level of government helped create this crisis. Now we as political leaders have to fix it. So let's do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Cressy. Councillor Fletcher.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My motion is on the screen, and that would be asked the Deputy City Manager, Cluster A, in conjunction with the Deputy City Manager, Internal Services, to report to City Council on discussions with faith organizations regarding opportunities for respite services in local churches where there's no longer services, where the churches aren't operating anymore. And I'm sure the Deputy City Manager has indicated that she'll be able to do that. So I just want to say that over, as I said earlier at our media conference, that there is tremendous support across Toronto from just everyday Torontonians who were in their warm houses over Christmas, so concerned about those without homes. To me, it's unprecedented, the number of people that were moved and want us to act, and the support that we actually have. So this is that moment when there's tremendous support from the public, there's tremendous support from the advocates, and there's tremendous momentum at the city level to make something happen. We did seem to have a perfect storm that I suspect with the system breakdown, communications-wise, that no matter how hard you're working, no matter how hard anybody's working, nothing is moving in the right direction. So I'm certainly assuming everybody was doing their best, working as hard as they could, and but when it's broken, it's broken. And I look forward, I'm waiting for the Ombudsman to say where that perfect storm happened, where that glitch in the system originated. And we also know that no matter how hard you work, if you don't have the resources, you can't deliver. And I was particularly struck with hearing that there has been a cap on money from the provincial government since the year 2012. Folks, that my math isn't always so great, but we're coming into 6 years for that. So you can't possibly expect that the chart that we were given, and I really have to tell you once more time how much I like your chart, that all of the numbers in here, that if you go back 6 years, it's just imagine if there was no cap. Imagine if we had the money. Imagine what that might look like if it didn't look like that. And so I really think that, and I'd like to know that number, and our Deputy City Manager has indicated we will come back and say, without that cap, here's what we would have had. And I think we're all in this together. It's great that we can hear from so many of you here today, all of the organizations and the leaders and the community leaders and people working on the front lines and from our staff, because there isn't a person who doesn't want to assist and make a better system. Right from homeless shelters, temporary shelters, right up to housing. And again, I'm going to speak about inclusionary zoning, something that we've asked for over and over and over again, to say that with the I don't know how many billions of dollars worth of development in this city, that the number of actual affordable housing, homes that have been required to be built have been negligible compared to the number of developments we have approved. And in this very room yesterday, we sat here, and I could go back and I could look at the number of units that we approved that are being brought forward, 300 just on Eastern Avenue, my little ward, and I don't have anything like Councillors Cressy and Wong Tam, where they're looking for 50, 60, 70, 80 stories is a normal application. Not one single piece of cement, not one brick, not one toilet, not one stove, nothing, not one part of those have 1 inch, 1 stick of affordable housing. And the new inclusionary zoning, I'm asking you all to get up to speed on that. Everybody who spoke here today, because you've told me in your letters over and over again, it's not good enough to talk about shelters, we have to talk about housing. So you have to be able to talk about housing too, friends. You have to know that that inclusionary zoning model will build nothing as far as what we're looking for in the number of units that have been approved. We have to have something from the province that allows us to build and doesn't allow the OMB to overturn. So I'm really asking you, please, be as passionate and careful as you are on shelters and come to our aid with inclusionary zoning. It's so important. And also,
All right, you're,
I'm over. I'm 5:38,
you're well
so that's
over, yeah.
fine. And I wish that we had federal staff here helping our staff run the shelters and shouldn't take shots at the city unless you're running the system yourself. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Fletcher. I'll just speak for a minute. I have one motion here. I crafted it before I realized that Councillor Wong-Tam has actually included harm reduction supports in item E in her motion, but I think I'll table it anyway. There are some concerns from some of the out-of-the-cold providers that users of needles are entering their facilities and causing deep distress. And these operators really don't know what to do with the cleanup and the needle disposal. And they requested a document, or they requested some support, and were sent a 90-page document on how to deal with it, and they just don't have the resources to go through that. I can see a problem here that unless we deal with this quickly, and that we help these organizations, their board of directors, when their rank and file catch wind of the fact that there's use of needle and disposal of needles on a church or a synagogue site, that their board of directors will not want the program at that location in the future. So it's very important to work with these groups to make sure that they have the education and the tools necessary to respond to the use of drugs on site, how to clean them, how to dispose of the needles, and make sure that they stay an active partner in what we're doing. Just want to point out in my comments that on December the 5th, at Council, December 6th, we passed a 26-point plan to direct staff back on a number of different strategic measures to take a good system and make it better. That, combined with what's being passed here today and what's going up to Council, sends a clear framework of where councillors want staff to take our shelter system, our respite system, make it better, improve it, make sure outcomes are better and measurable, and make sure that people stay healthy. With that, I'd just like to thank our dedicated staff. This has been a most difficult time. When it comes to homelessness, it is perhaps the most challenging social policy. You're dealing with mental health issues. You're dealing with substance abuse. You're dealing with medical complications of all kinds of variety. And it remains one of the toughest social policies to tackle. So our staff have done a remarkable job, and they have faced, through the popular media, unfair criticism of the great work that they're doing. And when you step back for a minute, you think that our staff and our city are responsible for housing or sheltering over 5,000 people on any given night and providing various supports for them. That is a monumental task. Many towns and villages across this country are not of that size, and you're dealing with a population that is actually the most challenging in our city, and we are supposed to provide them with a safe place to stay, to make sure people respect one another, to feed them, to keep them warm, to keep them safe. And it is a city within a city, and with that lens, it is important that we run our city within a city, that we provide the health care they need, we provide the transportation, the communication system, make sure we're measuring load factors so we send people to the right location in a timely basis, that families with school-age children are given the resources they need to make sure their kids are properly schooled in nearby locations, or if they're preschool, that proper daycare facilities are also supplied. This is almost too big a task for a city to manage, and that is why, and I repeat my colleagues' comments, that the federal and provincial governments must come to the table. There is no doubt in anyone's mind that refugee, asylum seekers, immigration is federal jurisdiction. There is no doubt around this table that health care is provincial jurisdiction. And yet when you see the problem that we're facing, homelessness is primarily a health care issue. The strain on our system is an immigration, newcomer, asylum seeker, refugee issue. These different levels of government must come to the table to help us do the job that we have to do, because cities are judged on how they treat their homeless, and only with the other two levels of government can we meet the kind of standard that we want in the city. So with that, I just wanted to thank all the deputants who came to share their views today. We learned a lot, we listened, and I think this dialogue was very worthwhile. And as I said, combined with the motions that we passed back in December at Council, in addition to the motions we're passing here, some will go directly to staff, some will go up to Council. I think staff now understand what we want and where we want to go and what kind of system we're trying to build here. So with that, we can start voting on these motions. We can take it as a package, that's fine. We don't have to record it. We'll take it as a package, it's one vote. Okay. Well, we can do a recorded vote on the entire package, if is that the request? Sure.
Okay, recorded vote on the package. All those in favor, Councillor Fletcher, Councillor Pasternak, Councillor Cressy, Councillor Wong-Tam, and Councillor Mahavik. That carries unanimously.
Great. Well, thank you very much. But don't go away, there's still work to do. So these are the new items we added. There we go. The first one here is 25-6. This was from Councillor Perusa, who I met with yesterday about this matter. I hope you've had a chance to read it. Are there any questions for staff? Any speakers? Then why don't we just put it to a vote? All those in favor? Opposed? That is carried. The second one is 25-7. Okay, here we go. Healthcare supports for New Hope Shelter, Leslieville. All those in favor? Opposed? That is carried. Wraparound services for emergency shelter at 354 George Street. There we go.
It's just one error.
Oh, we're gonna, okay, we'll make this change. It's 534 beds instead of 634.
Yes.
So that's, we will make that change before sending it to staff. Wraparound services for emergency shelter, 354 George Street. All those in favor? Opposed? That is carried. And a food hub for East End. All those in favor? Put your hand up. Okay, there you go. Opposed? That is carried. I think we're done. Great. Well, thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the day. It's a long day, very productive. Appreciate it. And once again, Happy New Year to all.